Welcome to episode 2 of the Mini Chameleon podcast with Dr. Michael Nash. Today we're going to be talking about enclosures. Often with smaller chameleons, we do have smaller cages, but that doesn't mean it's easier. It's actually a little bit more challenging. And so let's listen in to Dr. Nash as he talks about how to set up an enclosure for mini chameleons.
For the next part of this series, I'll talk a bit about enclosures that one can use to keep tiny chameleons, as well as the environment we're generally trying to replicate with our keeping. So the first question many people go to when caring for chameleons is whether it's a screen or hybrid enclosure. So for this discussion, I'll define hybrid enclosures as enclosures that have mostly solid sides with some screen or open areas that allow for ventilation. But typically for these enclosures, the sides might be made of something like PVC or coroplast, plastic, perhaps wood. Typically, 4 of the sides are closed. Maybe the front is screened, but typically most of the sides are closed, and then the top is screened as well to allow for some of that nice chimney effect ventilation, as long as there's some kind of way for air to get in from the front. So that's how I'm defining hybrid enclosure. And for this discussion, again, those are the enclosures I prefer to use. If I ever use screen enclosures, I will typically close off various sides of the enclosure, typically at least 3 of them, with a shrink window film or something similar. Now, the reason I do this is because I live in a very dry climate. I live in Colorado. So I really need all the help I can get to keep the humidity and temperature, or heat rather, in the enclosure without it just dissipating into the ether. So that's why I use hybrid enclosures. It gives you better control over various aspects of enclosure design. It helps keep the parameters you set more effectively, in my case, anyway. If you come from an environment where it's much more humid or warm, then you might have some other considerations. But for my purposes, that is what I recommend, hybrid enclosures. Glass works just as well. The design is very similar to many hybrid enclosures. Of course, it's simply with glass, and those work nicely too. Now, as I said earlier, we're trying to replicate various tiny microclimates in this enclosure that allow for appropriate humidity, water access in general, different hiding spots, plants, perches, and so on. So over the course of the day, what I replicate is actually high humidity most of the time. So how do I define that? During the day, the humidity usually ranges between 50 to 80%. Now, I don't often measure this with a hygrometer, although I have to confirm that my numbers are in the ballpark of what I'd expect. But what's really important about this is that even though that's the average humidity, there are other regions where the humidity is close to 100%. So that's sort of the baseline level of humidity. It's a bit higher than you usually hear for other species, other larger species. Now, part of the reason that we aim for lower humidity during the day for many of the commonly kept chameleons is because we want there to be appropriate time, so things like mold and bacteria can't grow as effectively. So this is a good approach. However, for these tiny chameleons, which I recommend keeping in bioactive environments, it becomes very, very difficult to provide a microclimate that offers the appropriate amount of moisture if the overall ambient humidity in the enclosure is as low as 30-40%. So when you start with the humidity that low, it becomes really hard to even create a pocket where it's near 100. That's why I allow the humidity to generally increase essentially all the time in these enclosures. And the concern, of course, is whether there's going to be mold or bacterial development. But in my experience, as long as there is ample airflow and the system is an effective bioactive setup, that has not been a problem. Even in sterile enclosures, that doesn't necessarily have to be a problem. You just have to monitor it very closely. So that's the baseline humidity I'm targeting. And of course, there is a natural cycle to go with this for over a 24-hour period. So overnight, I prefer the humidity to go up to near 100%. And I do this through two different methods, one of which is by reducing the amount of airflow. So I use fans for the enclosures. I reduce how frequently and for how long the fans run for overnight, which lets the humidity accumulate in the enclosure a bit easier. In addition to that, I do offer some misting throughout the night to kind of spike up the humidity as needed and allow that humidity to accumulate. Now, I won't go into this just yet, but fogging is another tool that can be used to achieve these purposes, although there are some caveats that I'll go through a bit later. But these are effectively the tools we have to increase the humidity at night, which should be very, very high. So in the morning then, I often will mist with an automatic system just to get enough so there's obvious dew and liquid accumulation on leaves and other parts of the enclosure. And then I might offer some more misting throughout the day, depending on the season I'm trying to replicate, which we can go through later. And then late in the afternoon, evening, I will also mist again. Typically, in the daytime, I have the fans running more frequently and more for longer periods of time than they do at night. So this also allows for more airflow, and although, again, the humidity is kept relatively high at all hours of the day, it does lower the humidity a little bit to have fans running more frequently during the daytime. So this is a bit distinct compared to night. So as I've alluded to, there is some discussion recently about whether we need to replicate distinct seasons for these chameleons. Personally, I do, and I found a lot of success in breeding and raising them with attention to what season I'm trying to replicate. So for many of the species I'll talk about, so tiny columas, Brachysia, they have quite distinct seasons that they experience in the wild. They're not really the same seasons we think of in the United States, like fall, winter, spring, summer. It's more so dry season, wet season. And many of these species live in forests, and many of them live in rainforests. So that might lead one to think that, well, the temperature is pretty much the same all year round, or the water is the same level of availability, but that's not actually true. Although rainforests are characterized by having rain at regular intervals, if you look at some of the climatic conditions that are available for us to examine, we find that even in the dry season, there's maybe a 50% reduction in the amount of rain. The number of rain days, for instance, in some regions where Kaluma Loco lives, it goes down from almost every day of the month during the rainy season to maybe half of the days. So even in an environment where there's a lot of rain, there still is some substantial seasonal variation. In addition to that, the temperature changes. When it's wet out, it's raining more regularly. Oftentimes, the nighttime drops don't tend to be as severe. So the temperature is warmer, but also it doesn't have as much variation between day and night. And the winter, or rather dry season, we see that the temperatures have a bigger drop at nighttime and it's generally cooler. Now, this matters because these chameleons have evolved and lived in these very specific areas. So even though we might think of the rainforest or some other region as being similar all year round, there are variations that I speculate the chameleons have been able to pick up on and adapt to, even though the differences depending on season are not as severe as we're used to seeing. So to summarize, I'd say that replicating these conditions is valuable for essentially any chameleon we have. Now, what we're still working on is how severe do we need to make the changes to obtain some kind of biological function of the chameleon. So for me, I found that cycling between colder, drier seasons and warmer, wetter seasons does tend to provoke breeding more reliably, and I found that animals, anecdotally, for me, appear to live longer if they're allowed these seasonal variations. Now, of course, that comes with a trade-off because during these drier periods of time where it's colder, they tend to be less active and eat less. So when we're raising them, I always raise them under conditions that replicate a more wet, rainy wet, warm season. Reason being, based on how the eggs go through diapause or based on when the adults breed, many of the babies seem to be born at times when it's wet and warm out. So if that you have a baby, it's best to keep it under the conditions it would likely be exposed to in the wild, which includes warmer, wetter seasons. So this is still an ongoing target. We're not completely certain exactly how severe we need to make these changes and ultimately if it's truly necessary for these small species to live a long life. But I would encourage keepers to at least allow some variation depending on the year, even if your house just tends to get colder or maybe a little bit warmer, and see how the animals respond. Because there's still a lot to figure out about all this, and sometimes differences in seasons can provoke really interesting behaviors that we might not be expecting otherwise. One of them is simply color changes, behavioral changes, interesting things like that we need to document better. So I'd recommend attempting to add some level of variation depending on season. Now, with that said, keeping them as pets, one could keep them with this so-called perfect day all year round, but unless your house is exactly the same all year round, there's naturally going to be opportunities to allow for variation in the humidity or perhaps the temperature or the difference between day and night drops. So I just encourage people to not be afraid of allowing those changes to hit their chameleon. Although it's certainly possible that that is not necessary for all species to live long and healthy lives. To circle back to keeping these chameleons in screen enclosures, for many homes and regions, like Colorado for instance, generally speaking, humidity is somewhat low. So although in an open screen enclosure you can offer small, more humid microclimates, maybe in the corner with a plant in it, with regular misting and so on, there still tends to be regions in the enclosure that might actually be dangerous when we're talking for chameleons of the size or very small size. So even though, let's say, the very back of the enclosure, sealed off by window film, is more humid than the front, the variation in microclimate has the potential to be so different than what the animals would typically experience that could be dangerous. So what I mean by that is maybe at the very front of the enclosure where there's the most airflow, you have a very, very dry pocket. For something so small as, let's say, a baby Columaro loco, if they even walk through that very dry region at the front of the enclosure, that alone might be damaging at such a critical stage. So although you can obtain some microclimates, it's sort of like putting an oasis in the middle of a desert versus putting a bigger pool of water in a marsh. The difference is that the animals might have to traverse more dangerous subclimates or microclimates to get to a region that they want to use. And while this works for many different chameleon species, and in fact, I tend to invite keepers to offer a lot of variation in how they set up their enclosures and the microclimates within, we're talking about very small animals like this, it's helpful to not offer quite the same difference in microclimates because those extreme differences due to limitations in our houses have the potential to cause damage. So if you have a very hot region of the enclosure, for instance, it might not be a good idea. If you have a very dry region, it might be difficult. And thus, using hybrid enclosures that are smaller and easier to manage help us make sure the microclimates offered are sort of within that preferred range that we need to keep them happy.
Thank you very much for joining us here and being dedicated to giving our mini chameleons the best care possible. And I'll see you next time when Dr. Nash comes back with the next episode of the Mini Chameleon Podcast. See you later.